President Trump ratcheting up the tariff war with a measure that could be another big blow to Canada. Donald Trump announced a 50% tariff on copper. Copper is a crucial component in a variety of goods, including electronics, machinery, and cars. This increase to the tariff on copper would mark the fourth across-the-board tariff Trump has imposed during his second term. What happens when the lifeblood of America's industrial engine suddenly becomes 50% more expensive overnight? That's exactly the question U.S. manufacturers and consumers were asking when Donald Trump walked into the cabinet room and announced one of the most aggressive protectionist moves in modern history. A sweeping 50% tariff on all imported copper justified under the banner of national security. The impact was immediate and brutal. Within just 24 hours, U.S. markets bled an estimated $4.2 billion in value. Copper prices spiked 13%, hitting an unprecedented $5.95 per pound, a record high. That sent shock waves through every sector that depends on this metal, from automakers and homebuilders to electronics giants scrambling for parts. Then came the second punch. Canada, America's closest trading partner and the supplier of nearly 40% of its refined copper, responded by freezing all export contracts to the United States without warning. For decades, this cross-border flow of copper had been so predictable, it was practically invisible. Now that trust was shattered, and a strategic resource that underpins everything from EV batteries to power grids had become a weapon in a widening trade war. How did we get here? And what does this mean for the industries and jobs that rely on copper's steady supply? Will this move drive the United States toward greater self-reliance? Or is it the first step toward isolating America from the very supply chains it helped build? Before we dive in, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content matters. Ottawa wasted no time making its position clear. Canada would not remain dependent on a trading partner it now viewed as unpredictable. In a rare unified statement from the Prime Minister's office and key provincial leaders, Canada announced it was beginning a sweeping realignment of its copper trade relationships. The message was blunt. The United States could no longer expect guaranteed access to Canada's refined copper reserves. Almost immediately, the country's mining giants, Teck Resources, and Hudbay Minerals, suspended all scheduled deliveries to American buyers. These companies, which for decades had funneled millions of pounds of copper into U.S. industries, redirected shipments to Asia and Europe, where buyers were eager to lock in stable long-term contracts. For Washington, this was more than just a trade dispute. It was the unraveling of a deeply entrenched supply chain. Ottawa backed up its hard line with action. Within days, the federal government announced a $1.8 billion CAD investment to expand export infrastructure across the country. New port facilities, upgraded rail networks, and modernized refining capacity were all part of the plan designed not just to handle more volume, but to reduce any structural reliance on the U.S. market. Officials made it clear that these moves were not a temporary response, but part of a deliberate long-term strategy to diversify Canada's trade profile. This was a pivotal moment. For decades, Canada had operated as a reliable pillar of the North American supply chain, quietly supporting U.S. manufacturing might. Now, it was openly building bridges to Europe and Asia, inking fresh agreements with South Korea, Germany, and even India. Each new deal further undercut America's ability to dictate terms and exposed how vulnerable its industries had become. The stakes could not be higher. The U.S. once counted on Canadian copper as a guaranteed resource. Now that tap had been turned off, perhaps permanently, and Ottawa showed no signs of backing down. The question wasn't whether America could convince Canada to resume normal trade. It was whether Washington could adapt fast enough before its own industries began to fracture under the pressure. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It's how we keep uncovering what others won't say. But Canada's withdrawal was only one piece of the puzzle. To fully understand America's predicament, we have to look beyond its northern neighbor and examine its other key copper suppliers, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. Because these countries now hold significant leverage in determining whether U.S. industries can weather this storm. Chile alone accounted for nearly 65% of the refined copper imported by the United States in 2024. According to a CISS report, That volume far outstripped any other supplier, eclipsing Canada and Peru combined. On paper, it would seem logical that Chile could fill the void left by Canada's abrupt export freeze. Yet, such assumptions ignore the geopolitical and logistical complexities at play. Chile's copper industry already faces heavy commitments to Asia, where long-term contracts with China and Japan leave little room for sudden surges in supply to the U.S. market. If Washington were to enforce the same 50% tariff on finished copper products such as wire tubing or specialized components, the situation could become even more complicated. Friendly partners like Chile would almost certainly push back, lobbying for preferential treatment or reduced tariffs, perhaps closer to 25%, to protect their existing export flows and avoid destabilizing global copper trade. Negotiating these exemptions, however, could take months, if not longer, leaving American industries scrambling to secure raw materials in the interim. Peru and Mexico, though smaller players than Chile, face similar constraints. Both have been expanding their copper exports to Europe and Asia in recent years, drawn by the promise of stable prices and predictable trade agreements. Shifting their sales back toward the U.S. would likely require significant incentives, possibly in the form of financial guarantees or infrastructure investments that Washington may be reluctant to offer under its current protectionist framework. This creates a dangerous window of vulnerability. If Canadian supply remains frozen and the U.S. fails to quickly arrange reliable replacements from Chile, Peru or Mexico, domestic copper inventories could plummet to critically low levels. Such shortages would force manufacturers into a bidding war for what little supply is available, further accelerating the already sharp rise in prices and putting entire production lines at risk of shutdown. In this environment, even a minor delay in securing alternative sources could cascade into a full-blown industrial disruption that would reverberate across the economy for months to come. The impact of Canada's withdrawal and the uncertainty surrounding other suppliers like Chile, Peru, and Mexico hit the American industrial supply chain with staggering force. Domestic copper prices surged to historic highs, trading at a premium as much as 25% above the London Metal Exchange LME benchmark. This unprecedented gap didn't just squeeze manufacturers. It threatened to rewrite the economics of entire industries. For decades, U.S. copper buyers could rely on predictable pricing in global markets. Now that predictability had evaporated, companies faced bidding wars for every available shipment, and even long-standing contracts were being renegotiated at much higher rates. Smaller businesses were hit the hardest, unable to absorb or pass on the sudden cost increases. For many, survival now hinged on whether they could source enough copper to keep production lines running. The problem was structural. The United States currently meets only 50% of its refined copper needs from domestic sources, a ratio that leaves it dangerously exposed to global market fluctuations. While the country has significant raw copper mining operations, its refining capacity is deeply constrained, concentrated in a handful of aging facilities that were never designed to scale up quickly in a crisis. Factories that produce the backbone of America's economy. Electronics, automobiles, and construction materials were already beginning to falter. Automakers warned of impending production cuts as copper wiring shortages delayed electric vehicle assembly lines. Construction companies reported skyrocketing costs for building materials, with even basic infrastructure projects facing indefinite delays. And in Arizona, Asaro's copper refineries, long seen as critical to the domestic supply chain, were running at full tilt, but still couldn't come close to replacing the volumes previously imported from Canada. This wasn't just about copper. It was about the cascading impact on every industry that depended on it. Without sufficient refined copper, U.S. manufacturers faced the prospect of layoffs, plant closures, and contract cancellations. The ripple effects threatened to move swiftly from industrial hubs into the broader economy, disrupting jobs, consumer prices, and even government infrastructure initiatives. And yet, the most concerning factor was that this supply chain crisis was only just beginning to unfold. The next question was whether the United States could mitigate its vulnerabilities or if the shortages would deepen into a long-term structural collapse. But America's vulnerability doesn't end with domestic shortfalls or the loss of Canadian supply. There's an even larger geopolitical risk looming over the entire crisis. China's near total dominance of the global refining chain. According to data from the International Energy Agency and the Financial Times, China controls roughly 70 to 75% of the world's refining infrastructure for strategic minerals, with copper sitting at the center of this advantage. This dominance gives Beijing an unparalleled ability to influence pricing and availability at precisely the moment when the United States can least afford additional disruption. What makes this position even more powerful is China's flexibility in volatile markets. Analysis from Ng and Bloomberg shows that when copper prices swing wildly, Chinese refiners have the capacity to quickly pivot and flood the market with refined copper exports to balance inventories. This reactive capability allows Beijing to capitalize on crises while stabilizing its own domestic supply, effectively turning global market turbulence into an opportunity for the United States. This dynamic creates a dangerous dependency. With so much refining capacity concentrated in a single country that is also a strategic rival, Washington risks being outmaneuvered on multiple fronts. Even if raw copper supplies could be secured from other countries, the lack of refining capability outside China means the U.S. would still face bottlenecks and higher costs to access the finished metal it desperately needs. This geopolitical reality adds another layer of urgency to the unfolding supply chain crisis. It's not just about losing Canadian imports or dealing with higher prices. It's about the possibility that America's industrial future could hinge on a supply chain increasingly shaped by its greatest economic competitor. The shock waves from the copper shortage did not stay confined to factories and industrial supply chains. They quickly rippled through the broader U.S. economy, hitting consumers directly. Nowhere was the impact more visible than in the automotive sector, where the cost of electric vehicles surged by $3,000 to $6,000 per car. Automakers cited the soaring price of copper wiring, battery connectors, and other essential components, warning that the spike would slow adoption of electric vehicles at a time when the nation was trying to meet ambitious climate targets. Housing was next. Builders reported that the cost of constructing a single-family home had jumped by $17,000 to $22,000. Copper is deeply embedded in the building process, from plumbing and wiring to HVAC systems, and the price increases left developers with no choice but to pass higher costs on to buyers. For families already struggling with inflation and high mortgage rates, this added expense pushed home ownership even further out of reach. The energy sector also felt the squeeze. Power companies were forced to raise electricity rates as the cost of copper conductors and transformer cores spiked by 20–25% according to industry data. This wasn't just a problem for utilities' bottom lines. It meant higher monthly bills for millions of households and businesses, further eroding disposable income and slowing economic activity. Economists began to sound the alarm. UBS released a report warning that if the crisis persisted, U.S. GDP could contract by 0.5% in the coming quarter. That might sound small, but in an economy as large as America's, even a 0.5% drop translates to tens of billions in lost output, and a cascade of secondary effects from lower tax revenues to increased pressure on social safety nets. Small businesses, particularly those in the electronics and cable manufacturing sectors, were among the hardest hit. Many lost contracts they had relied on for years because they simply couldn't compete with lower-cost producers in Asia, where copper supply chains were more stable. Some companies shuttered altogether, unable to survive the double blow of higher input costs and lost market share. Others slashed payrolls, adding to the wave of layoffs already hitting communities dependent on manufacturing. In just a matter of weeks, what had begun as a tariff policy intended to project strength was translating into financial pain for everyday Americans. Prices were rising across multiple sectors. Wages weren't keeping up, and businesses were losing ground to overseas competitors. And as the crisis deepened, another question loomed. How would these economic tremors affect America's ability to compete in the industries of the future? The deeper implications of the copper crisis go far beyond immediate consumer pain or short-term GDP losses. Copper is a foundational material for America's energy transition, semiconductor manufacturing, and green industrial ambitions. And the shortage now threatens to derail progress in all three. A joint report published in 2025 by the International Energy Agency, IEA, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCCTAD, underscored copper's central role in building the future economy. From smart grid infrastructure and wind turbines to electric vehicles and semiconductor fabrication, copper is the essential conductor that allows modern energy and digital systems to function. Any disruption in supply is not just a logistical problem. It is a direct threat to the country's ability to compete in next-generation industries. Yet, the United States faces a structural disadvantage. While it has robust raw copper mining operations, its domestic refining capability can meet only about 5% of total demand. This leaves the country heavily reliant on imports for the refined copper needed to manufacture high-value products. In normal times, this reliance is a vulnerability. In a crisis like this, it becomes an existential threat. With international supplies disrupted and prices soaring, U.S. manufacturers cannot quickly scale up domestic production to fill the gap. Projects to build new refining facilities take years, if not decades, to permit and complete. That lag time creates a critical window in which America's rivals, particularly China and Europe, can solidify their lead in industries like clean energy and advanced electronics. If copper remains scarce or disproportionately expensive for American companies compared to their foreign competitors, the consequences could be long-lasting. U.S. firms may delay or cancel investments in renewable energy infrastructure, fall behind in producing the chips and electronic systems that drive the global economy, and lose ground in electric vehicle manufacturing just as the market enters its most competitive phase. This isn't just about falling behind in one sector. It's about ceding leadership across the entire spectrum of high technology and green industries that will define the 21st century economy. While the United States struggled to contain the fallout from its self-inflicted copper crisis, Canada was quietly repositioning itself as a rising power in the global metals trade. No longer willing to operate as a junior partner feeding raw materials into the U.S. industrial machine, Ottawa set its sights on building a reputation as a central hub for refined copper and other strategic minerals, with Asia as its primary customer base. Canadian officials worked with remarkable speed and discipline. Trade delegations were dispatched to Seoul, Tokyo, and New Delhi, where they signed preliminary agreements to guarantee long-term supplies of refined copper at competitive prices. These deals not only secured new revenue streams, but also allowed Canada to forge deeper strategic ties with economies hungry for reliable access to raw materials. By cultivating relationships across Asia, Canada was ensuring its copper would flow to markets that valued stability and predictability qualities. Washington had eroded with its sudden tariff policies. This strategic pivot was enabled by Canada's growing investment in its refining infrastructure. Federal and provincial governments partnered with industry to expand smelters, modernize port facilities, and strengthen rail and pipeline networks to move metals efficiently to coastal export terminals. These projects weren't just about immediate profit. They were about locking in a competitive advantage that would endure long after the dust settled from the tariff dispute. For the United States, the consequences were stark. Without sufficient domestic refining capacity and stripped of its bargaining leverage, America was increasingly being pushed to the margins of the global copper value chain. Where once U.S. buyers could count on preferential treatment from Canadian suppliers, they were now competing with Asian and European customers who were often willing to pay more and who enjoyed the backing of governments actively courting Ottawa. Perhaps most importantly, Canadian leaders made it clear that this was not a short-term retaliation for the 50% tariff. It was a deliberate long-term strategy to reduce economic dependence on the United States and strengthen Canada's position as a strategic resource powerhouse. By diversifying its customer base and building self-sufficiency into its supply chains, Canada was doing what Washington had long urged its allies to do. Only now, the United States was the one left on the outside. As Canada cemented its role as a major player in the global metals trade, the United States faced a deepening economic crisis. Unprecedented price gaps and supply shortages were reshaping markets faster than Washington had anticipated. Inflation was rising across copper-dependent sectors and an industrial slowdown was becoming impossible to ignore. Economists warned this was more than a market correction. With U.S. copper prices far above global benchmarks and inventories dwindling, manufacturers delayed investments, cut production and shut facilities, triggering job losses and ripple effects across communities. Some experts even compared the situation to the protectionist policies of the 1930s Hoover era, which fractured trade networks and worsened the Great Depression. As refined copper stockpiles neared critical lows, businesses paid steep premiums just to secure supply, driving up costs on everything from electric vehicles to household utilities. For millions of Americans, the copper crisis was no longer abstract. It was eroding their quality of life. And if inventories collapsed completely, rationing price shocks and waves of bankruptcies could follow. Raising the larger question, can the U.S. maintain its place as a competitive industrial power at all? The United States now faces a critical inflection point. Its pursuit of aggressive protectionist policies may be designed to secure greater self-reliance. But is it instead pushing the country further away from the global supply chains it depends on? The warning signs are everywhere. Rising costs, shrinking inventories, and competitors forging deeper international partnerships while Washington stands increasingly alone. If no new strategy emerges, could America lose its position at the center of the copper industry and by extension the advanced manufacturing and energy sectors built upon it? The possibility is no longer hypothetical. Every day that passes without a course correction brings the U.S. one step closer to a reality where it is priced out and pushed out of the industry shaping the future economy. Thanks for watching, and if this resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every click fuels the truth, and we'll be here uncovering the stories others won't tell. But here's the question you should ask yourself. If America continues down this path, who will step in to fill the void it leaves behind? And what will that mean for the